We're going to go ahead and get started. As people join, they can just join in as we're going. I want to give us as much time as we can while we have Dr. Hummel here so that we can ask a lot of questions and things. First of all, thank you all so much for coming to our January early onset chapter meeting. I appreciate all your time. I know we're all very busy. I appreciate you carving out some time for this very important meeting. We are honored to have Dr. Ray Raymond Hummel with us today to speak to us about clinical trials and rare disease drug development. Dr. Hummel is the Vice President of Medical and Scientific Strategy. He is head of the Rare Disease Consortium and the executive sponsor of the People with Disabilities Employee Resource Group at Syneos Health Clinic in North Carolina. He has authored or co-authored over 80 scientific publications. His latest book, entitled Rare Diseases, Drug Development, and Clinical Scientific Patient and Caregiver Perspectives, was published in November. And I will put in the chat, I'll put a link to where you can find that book if you want to go look at that book. He is the father to 2 children with early onset FSHD. His daughter Meredith co-wrote the chapter on FSHD. So again, we are very pleased to have Dr. Hummel here, and I will turn it over to him, and I'll just start with asking him a few questions. He's going to introduce himself to us, and we're going to
Dr. Hummel with
asking a few questions, and then if you have questions, as questions come up, feel free to chime in and ask your questions. This is a roundtable, so we're here just to discuss it and get his expert opinion on how we can best get our kids involved in clinical trials and eventually work toward treatment or a cure for FSHD. So with that, I turn the floor over to you, Dr. Hummel.
Thanks. So, like for those who are older who watch TV, it says you can call me Ray. So I appreciate the official title, but I hope that I will be considered, after you get to know me better, a true patient advocate of those with FSHD. I have, ever since my daughter was diagnosed first, and then later my son, I've decided to try to learn all that I can about FSHD. And one of the best ways to learn, I found, is to be a teacher. So that's why I write articles and the book and things like that, because I get challenged. And to be challenged is to improve and to stretch and to get better. So I've been privileged to have my daughter helping me, and even my son more recently in the book. And they're both champions of trying to find, disease cures. I will tell you, part of the reason behind this book I wrote stems from kind of a long past, and I can distill it into like just 1 or 2 minutes here. So let me just, if I can, tell you. So when my daughter was first diagnosed, the first thing I did was I joined the FSHD Society. And that was proved to be a good move, because they knew more than the physicians and the neurologists, many of the neurologists and many of the interns that were either examining my daughter or I was getting to meet as I was starting to enter this process. And my daughter and I learned at some of the MDA care centers that there really was kind of a paucity of information other than just, look up your disease on the web and good luck. So we actually wrote a book on all types of muscular dystrophies. And when I asked Meredith to look at it for me, because she's pretty good at journalism, she said, well, it's kind of missing the patient advocacy perspective here. And I says, well, who am I going to get to write that? And she said, well, I'll do it. And I said, what? And I thought that some of the chapters that were on like genetics and real complex and very difficult, some kind of pharma speak and a little bit of medical speak in there, would be really good and really impressive. And actually one of the most downloaded chapters was actually the patient advocacy chapter, and part of it included a story by Meredith about her journey with dealing with FSHD. And that theme actually resonated with my book, to try to make sure that we not only included the key stakeholders in my life that were dealing with FSHD, but because some of those were so advanced that they could have lessons for others. So we actually asked June to write the chapter on the patient perspective, because I've known her from even before she supported other types of patients, not just those with FSHD, and she has a true heart for the patient. So Meredith agreed to chip in, and then we had people like, I had met a guy James Valentine, who did the patient-focused drug development meeting for those with FSH, who many of you may have been involved with that or contributed yourselves or your family members. And so I actually solicited his help for the regulatory portion of it, along with the head of Every Life Foundation. So, there's a lot of folks in that book, and to tackle FSHD or to tackle any of the rare diseases is going to take a village, as we all know. And unfortunately, one of the things I'm finding with folks is that they really don't understand the drug development paradigm. And the other thing that doesn't help is that once you kind of understand the drug development paradigm, it changes because the FDA changes its rules, updates things as it gets more information. And then also as you get more and more drugs into the pipeline for FSHD or any of these other rare diseases, then the landscape changes as well, because now the standard of care could potentially change. And we hope that, folks like our friends at Fulcrum are successful, because, we really desperately need treatments and support everybody working in that. But like I said, there's a real gap. Meredith and I and John found, and others found, that there's a gap in rare disease drug development. So two things I wanted to let this group know is, one is that all proceeds from the book are going to the FSHD Society. So I want everybody to know that. And also want them to know that I want to try to also put kind of our money where our mouth is a little bit too. So we're donating 50 copies of the book to the FSHD Society to give out to folks to make them, understand that, and it'll go according to donors and other criteria that the FSHD Society establishes. But I just think it's important for people to understand it, and that's part of the reason why I'm here today. So if I can help you kind of demystify any of the things about that, because one of the things when I was talking to Allie about was that if we could just kind of collect some of the information on our kids, we could have maybe a regulatory supported natural history study. And that would be enough to be able to be used as a clinical trial arm, so that we can compare the disease progression from, say, a drug or a product against that natural history that we know. And it's a little more sophisticated than what you might think. And, like I said, I had to solicit over 40 people to help for that book. So it's not something that Ray could tell you everything about rare disease drug development in, an hour on a phone. But I can tell you that, there are some challenges that you need to think about natural history studies, regulatory compliant information that can be usable, what the type of things that regulators are looking for. And then the other thing we have to be cognizant of is two things that I think are really important. One is, how do our efforts dovetail with existing efforts from the FSHD Society? Because that's kind of our leader and our group kind of followers. So what are they doing? Is there things we can augment that they already have? Are there things in place that they have that we could leverage to help us get there? And the answer, of course, is yes. They have a actually for, I would say, when looking at some of the larger muscular dystrophy patient advocacy groups, they've actually, given their size, I think have actually outpaced some of the things that they've done as far as their clinical trial ready network and some of the other things that they've done. So, I tip my hat to the FSHD Society because they're doing a lot of things. The other thing is that the FSHD Society is moving ahead, trying to help in the context of those who are working in the clinical drug development space. And those folks work along the tightest and most rigorous guidelines. So those like Fulcrum and others on the phone who may be supportive of another sponsor or another folk who are trying to help those with FSHD, they're constrained with that too. So those are the contexts, and those are some of the challenges that we're dealing with. So, when I was asked to give this talk, I said, unfortunately, I'm actually taking my son back to Boston, which is a couple-day process because it's kind of far to get up there. So we hip-hopped and saw a couple relatives on the way up, and then I drove more or less straight back. But it was a multi-day thing, so I didn't really have anything prepared for slides. So I want to leave this kind of an open session to have different questions. So I know Allie had a couple other questions, which I'll be glad to entertain. But if there's any questions from you guys, I would like to take this opportunity to be able to spend a few minutes and also let you know that, my hours aren't just from this, 8 to 9 or whatever like that, Eastern time for me. That, if I can ever help anybody here, while I'm the head of the Rare Disease Consortium and I actually dislike all rare diseases equally, I will tell you that, I'm unabashedly biased towards FSHD. And if there's anything I can do to help anyone personally or professionally, then please let me know, because I do have access to different networks and different folks. And again, it's not one person being expert. I've seen that the best experts are those that not only know what they know, but also know what they don't know so that they can get it and surround themselves with experts so that they can get that information. And those are the folks that I try to emulate is if I don't have the information, at least if I could know where I could find the information, then that's sometimes just as important.
Okay, does anybody have any questions before I sort of just?
Looks like Paul's got a comment or a question.
Okay.
Paul, you want to go?
Yeah, hey, really appreciate you, Raymond, especially saying with the travel, taking the time to meet with us here today. It's my first time here with the group. And I know there's a lot of new emphasis around FSHD1 in children's and youth, but do you know if there's any of the clinical trials currently going on around FSHD2? Because my son has been diagnosed with FSHD2, and it's a rare disease, and it's been even rarer to find individuals that diagnosed with that at a young age. So we're struggling, as my wife and I, to understand and to find resources for that. I mean, we're blessed in many ways because we're right here in Richmond, and Children's Hospital Richmond is a huge advocate for FSHD and trials going on there. But I guess when we talk about clinical trials, are there things focused solely on FSHD1, which is as rare as it is, the more common, versus FSHD2? Or am I just wrong in my thinking entirely, which is possibility to learn this process?
I'll tell you what I know, and then others can chip in that could add to this conversation. Like I know June probably could. Is so like about 6 or 7 years ago, my daughter and I formed what later became the North Carolina chapter of the FSHD Society. We started meeting with folks, and as we were meeting families with FSHD or dealing with it, or even patients themselves, the first question came is do you have something in a concise, like 3 or 4 page manner that explains what FSHD is and kind of where it comes from and what it is and what some of the limitations, what some of the things you can do are? So my daughter said, well, that's not like an easy question, you know what I mean? So that took us about a year. We had to meet with a couple neurologists and some friends, and we published a paper on an overview of FSHD. Not that we didn't refer anybody to the FSHD Society, but this is just like a little, 2, 3, 4 pager that you could have. And then after we presented that to the group, they said, that's good, but what we really want now is we want a paper on what's in the drug development pipeline. Can you tell me what the pipeline is? I said, well, the pipeline is growing. There's like 4 or 5 different major things that people are looking at. But again, that's not something you can just answer like in a conversation. I went back, I talked to the same neurologist and a couple of other friends, and we published a paper on what's in the pipeline. That was in 2017, so it's a few years old. At that time, there was no differentiation between FSHD1 or 2 or infantile onset in a way, really, because they were all seen as kind of, in some ways, being phenotypically similar, even though that the age of onset for early onset seemed to be a little more symptoms, and then it seemed like it might be a little more severe or maybe rapidly progressing, the infantile onset. But there was really no specific things. And even further behind that, there really wasn't a way to split it out. When my daughter was first diagnosed, there was no genetic tests. So, it's only been relatively recently that we've even had genetic tests. I'm not aware of anybody that's splitting them out by a subset of that, but I do know that the majority is FSHD1 patients that have been diagnosed. But even things like the DZ repeats, where, a certain lack might be correlated to a certain clinical progression, is slowly finding that some of the things that we thought about before might be challenged. So while there is some certain things with like larger deletions and things are shown with more severity and things like that, there's a few exceptions, and it makes it harder to make a blanket statement on any one of them. I'm not aware, though, of any personal clinical trial right now that currently subsets out FSHD2 versus FSHD1 or even infantile onset, which I would appreciate even looking into each one of those specifically, but I'm not aware of any capital funding that's doing clinical trials. June, are you?
So the thing with FSHD2 is it's regarded as kind of different genetic cause that ends up with the same downstream disease-causing effect, which is the expression of this DUX4 gene. And so depending on the therapy, for example, losmapimod affects something upstream, like before DUX4 gets expressed, it does something that keeps the DUX4 from being expressed. I believe it's really it was discovered by screening different drugs in cells that I think were derived just from FSHD type 1 patients. And it raises an interesting question whether they ever screened it in FSHD type 2, because, that would then let you hypothesize whether the drug would be effective in FSHD type 2 as well as FSHD type 1. So I actually am going to write to one of the scientists who had worked on that screening to see if they can tell me, because I actually don't know the answer to that. I think from the point of view of clinical trial design, companies try to make them as simple as possible, get rid of any factor that could muddy the data or make it hard to interpret the data. So given that there are very few FSHD2 patients to start with, I think there was a concern that if you mix up the genetics of the patients who are in the trial, that might have some unknown effect that, let's just play it safe and just leave it, restrict it to FSHD type 1 patients. When I've spoken with Fulcrum scientists, I think they say they don't see a priori any reason why it would not work in FSHD type 2 patients. But that's a big question mark. Can you make that case to the FDA if you haven't actually done a trial in FSHD type 2 patients? That's an important question. There are other trials that are being planned that use a different mechanism that directly targets the messenger RNA of DUX4. So it's presumed that both FSHD type 1 and type 2 patients would have this DUX4 RNA floating around that needs to be neutralized. So I think that's a pretty strong rationale that you could test this in both FSHD type 2 and type 1 patients. But again, the companies might decide to just try to simplify, reduce possible error, sources of noise, and only test in FSHD type 1. But I don't know. That would be a very good question for us to ask them. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, and Paul, just to add to that too, I will tell you that one thing that the FDA has seen that I've seen from other drugs, like with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, is that certain targets are so specific for a subpopulation. So like when you take Duchenne muscular dystrophy and look at it, it's reported sometimes in the literature as the most common muscular dystrophy, and I've seen things where it could be the second or third most because it changes, because prevalence and incidence is a little tough sometimes to get a handle on. The other thing too is people are trying to look for very specific populations. So like the approvals that they have in DMD now are for some of the technologies. One is an exon skipping technology by Sarepta. They've got 3 approvals now in that. The first one was for Exondys for exon amenable skipping technologies for mutation 51. So that's why they call it 51. And what you end up with when you study a subset is you end up too with not being applicable necessarily for the entire population. So that's roughly, and don't quote me on the exact number, but roughly 10% of the population. So that means that the reimbursers too, or the payers at the end, will only pay for like that population. So what some people try to do is say, well, if it works for that, it may work for other exon amenable skipping populations as well. And then you end up with a reimbursement debate down the line. So it is very important to define the patient population, not just for the approval, but also for payer and reimbursement access.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned early onset. In my son's case, it's not necessarily early onset. He's 8 going on 9, and we were diagnosed at 6. So it's kind of like that unknown territory, if you will. So I would appreciate, June, if you do get any more information on that study that was potentially breaking down 1 versus 2 in the DUX4 expression and suppressing that through RNA development therapy, please. I would love to figure out how do I follow up with you, I guess, on that.
Sure. Yeah, I'll let you know what we find out. I assume you're signed up on our research contact registry, so that is the lifeline for getting information about studies and trials coming up. So definitely everybody wants to be informed about it. Make sure you're signed up. It's on our website. And we'll keep talking about this. Thank you for bringing that up. Where are you located, by the way, Paul?
We're in Central Virginia.
Okay.
Right.
You
just
mentioned
south of Richmond, Virginia.
Right.
So Children's Hospital Richmond. I know that it's one of the FSHD hubs, and so we do see our doctors at that facility, which has been amazing. So
Yeah.
Is that clinicaltrial.gov? Is that where I'm sorry, that Rochester Neurology National Registry that was posted? Is that the way to register?
You can find let's see, you can find them through clinicaltrials.gov. You can also find them on the FSHDsociety.org website.
The one thing I will tell you is that while you can find them on the clinicaltrials.gov, the FSHD website, not only that, but they also update things and they have more interactions with, like, the sponsors and things like that. So sometimes I actually lean a little more towards FSH Society in that regard, but you can look them up on clinicaltrials.gov. And the other thing too, I will say is that regardless how we tackle this, it does help us if we all chip in. So, like, I do think the more information and the more data is better. So there's only a few of us, right? This is a rare disease. So if you can contribute in any way, either as a caregiver or as a patient directly, I'll put a plug in that it does help, because I know it can be altruistic. And I also know from talking to patients that there's some patients that, don't want to get things like biopsies that are unnecessary. They don't want to get unnecessary stuff. And that's why I'm a big proponent also of the patient voice in rare disease drug development. If you look at our book, it'll say that, we've tried to include the patient voice where we can. I mean, I actively support groups that have, and I believe Fulcrum does this and others, have their protocol and share it with patients first before they actually undergo it, because it's not just about identifying patients for clinical trials, it's convincing them and providing a compelling argument for them to want to go into a clinical trial. And that's the harder holy grail. It's not just about finding patients, because I have found many patients for some trials, and some will readily go in and some won't. And every person is different, right? So we all come from a different experience, and we need to be able to make a compelling argument for people to be in clinical trials. So it's kind of funny because people think, well, you're in industry that runs clinical trials, so you would support every person being in clinical trial. And I'm not. I actually believe that it's first and foremost, if you're an adult, that it's up to that person, obviously, the FSH that has it. But let's face it, we all have caregiver teams that are large, right? I mean, there can be, somebody that cares for us very deeply, that goes with us all the time, or maybe a partner or somebody. And then we also have our neurologists, and some of us maybe with some more severe forms may have pulmonologists or occupational therapists, physical therapists. I would contact everyone and make it, kind of find out everybody to decide whether you should be in a clinical trial or not, because there are risks involved within clinical trial participation as well as potential rewards. So you just have to realize all those before you go in. And like a good lawyer, you should balance them and see which one goes in your favor. And if it's neutral or negative, then you need to reconsider whether that should be there. I mean, one thing that the FSHD Society is going to face in the future is with these gene therapies. So the adeno-associated virus, or what they call the AAV vector technology, which you guys are watching right now unfold in the DMD space especially, it's also coming to the limb-girdle muscular dystrophy space. They're being investigated there. And they're going to come to the FSHD Society space one day, the gene therapies. And what you need to know about gene therapies is you can only do one gene therapy in your entire life. So it's what they call, just like in basketball, NCAA basketball, one and done. You come in and you can do it one time and that's it. And that's the way it's set up right now. That's the way the game's played. Now, the game may change, the goalpost may change, but for right now, it's a one and done thing. So, just start thinking about gene therapies and start looking around and learning a little bit about gene therapies as well, because I do believe that, after talking to folks in FSH Society and other people in industry, that there are some things that are amenable to treating DUX4 and even some other things with FSHD. So, that may be something in the future to consider.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, people have talked about gene therapy so long that, I think the general public thinks of it as like this magic bullet out there.
Yeah.
But it is a very complicated issue with the viruses that are used to transfer the gene into your cells, and your immune system can develop recognize the virus in the next. That's why you can only do one dose. The second dose, your immune system is going to knock it out before it can get into your cells. So, it's got to be done, with incredible care, a lot of research before that to kind of make sure if you're going to do this, it works. I do want to clarify, though, there are these antisense therapies that are the next in line after the small molecules like Fulcrum's losmapimod. Dyne, Avidity, and Arrowhead are all developing what are called antisense oligomers. So those are the ones that target the messenger RNA, so they don't get inside your DNA and start making, therapeutic molecules from your own DNA. they put this antisense that recognizes the messenger RNA, knocks it out, but then you have to have repeated doses. I'm not sure what frequency, not daily certainly, but it's not a one and done. But I just want to mention that because they're often lumped together as gene therapy, and you might get confused about it. That is, ASOs are not gene therapy. I just wanted to make sure you had
June,
that context.
Yeah, that's a good point. The antisense oligonucleotides I've seen too, that platform technology, they use that a lot in the N of 1 studies and things like that, because it's the platform technology by some companies, and you can look them up, but because I work with some of them and I know some of them, but those technologies are amenable to like a very small patient population. So potentially, FSHD, but also ones where maybe only 1, 2, 3, or less than 10 people actually have that disease. And the FDA is getting incredibly supportive of that. And I've been involved with some conversations on that as well, where, you can do that. But like you said, then you have to constantly get an infusion. Back to the gene therapies, though, not only does it affect the person who gets it, and all the ramifications that June mentioned, but also we're seeing that there's family members. So everybody knows an FSH2 of a brother or sister combination, or somebody that has multiple people in a family. So if you actually get the gene therapy, say, and you have a brother or sister at home and you shed that virus, then the other person can develop antibodies to it, making it so that person can't get it won't work in that family member. So you have to actually isolate the person that's getting it from the entire family, or those who potentially could, take a therapy down the line. So there's more. It's not just affecting just the person taking the drug, but it can affect their whole family. So the gene therapies are, like I said, I think at least worth looking into, because it is something that I do think could come the way of FSHD patients in the relatively near future.
So before we get to actual trials and studies, we need to do a natural history, a retrospective natural history. I guess we need to create one to present to the FDA. Is that correct?
So you can do a retrospective. You can also do a prospective, and people do both. So,
Okay.
But I'll go ahead, June. You were going to say something. Oh,
I'm sorry. Yes, we actually had a meeting about this. Was it yesterday? Oh my goodness, it seems like a week ago. But so and it's worth your all knowing. We've been talking to a lot of different people about what should we be doing for pediatric FSHD patients, and there are a lot of people very interested in thinking about it. So we said, well, let's just get a bunch of them together, including a couple of parents. So Kristen and Allie are on this working group. We invited Natalie Katz from Rochester, Tina Duong from Stanford, Sabrina Yum from Children's Hospital Philadelphia, and Kathy Matthews, who's probably the most senior and well-known person focused on early onset and juvenile FSHD. And so we talked about, so natural history is so important, because when you're going to test a drug in anybody, you need to know how are you going to bend the trajectory. What do they look like if they're not treated? What does their progression look like if they're not treated? Because your drug is you have to show that you're going to change that trajectory. And if you don't know what the trajectory is, the FDA is going to say, like, you haven't shown me anything, right? So, so natural history is the most fundamental thing you need for a disease like FSHD. We're not talking about a disease where if you don't treat that person, they're going to be dead in a week, right? And if they're alive, your drug works, right? It's not like that. It's the person is having muscle loss over a period of years. It's unpredictable, and we want to try to stop that or slow it down. So to show that, you've got to know what that trajectory looks like, and it's going to be different from different patients. So we have to understand, can we define a group of patients where it kind of looks like this on average? And here's a different group that looks like this, right? So there are two ways to do about one is a prospective going forward, natural history study, and there's one going on right now that everybody should consider, if it's at all practical, enrolling your child in this. It's the MOVE study, and it's open to all ages. It's taking place in 12 centers across the U.S., and you can do it during your regular clinic visit. And it's a standardized set of strength measurements that can be done, and it'll run for 2 to 3 years. And hopefully, with enough patients signed up, you'll get some good, prospective natural history data. And there's a branch of that that's also, they added more patients who will be doing the MOVE study plus getting magnetic resonance imaging. Now, I don't know if the MRI part is also including children. It would be interesting if they did, but I don't know for sure if they are. I can check into that. But the MOVE study is super important, and because it is open to children, it's an opportunity. And right now they're saying they're not getting a lot of children signing up, so let's kind of surprise them and get an influx of kids, because it will make a difference for all of you. And
do we know how many kids are actually signed up in that study already?
I don't know. I can ask.
So is there like a structured, since we're already having to a prospective study, the MOVE study, do we have any kind of outline of protocol elements like description of methods for data collection, diagnosis, definition, all the things the FDA requires to present whenever you do want to present this data information? Do you know if that's kind of outlined yet?
It is. It's very,
Okay.
The protocol is outlined. It's described in painstaking detail on clinicaltrials.gov.
Yes, I have it pulled up in front of me. I'm sitting here highlighting through it. So yes, it is detailed, but it's pretty helpful though.
But it's very carefully thought out. A lot of the work in the Resolve study went in, like the best of Resolve is going into, into the MOVE study. So, so I think, love everyone to know more about it and think about it. And then the other approach is to look backward in time, the retrospective study. And there, the question is, can we gather enough medical records from all of your kids and everybody else out there who's got kids who've been diagnosed with FSHD? And in principle, you could say we should be able to pull the data out of that can show for each kid, like document how different strength measures changed, year over year, every 6 months or however. And some people, some of the kids, they're now adults, but you still have those kids, children. That could be so valuable. What we don't know is, was it collected in, a standardized way across the country, across so many different doctors' offices, so that we have enough apples to compare to other apples? Or is it going to be all over the place and you really wouldn't be able to make much out of it? Or maybe some of it is collected in a very standardized way. So I've been asking that question of pediatric neurologists, and I think the sense is it's worth trying. It's really worth looking. That,
Right.
The neurologists do get kind of certain standardized trainings and ways of doing things. It probably means somebody somewhere is going to have to dedicate them a lot of time to going through the chart and figuring out kind of the data, how to represent the data in a database.
Right. How to quantify the subjective data.
Exactly. And maybe how to harmonize it. So, maybe one doctor's using one scale, another one's using a different one, but you can actually do a conversion. You just have to. So we're looking seriously into that. I mean, you would need somebody, like a clinical fellow or a doctor or someone, or even for that matter, it might be a volunteer in this society who has the training and the background to do this kind of work. But we need to find a body who could do that.
Right.
Or, another possibility is, we develop like a standard framework and train all the parents. You're like, this is how here's how you look at your chart. And, there are a lot of, it's time to get creative, I think, on how we could do something like that.
Right, June, and that's what we want to kind of activate the parents to go out and get their records, get them somewhere. And I know the FSHD Society is looking at where that collective somewhere is going to be, so that we can make up some time here, right? Instead of going just a proactive study, go back to retroactive, because we all have records on our kids.
Exactly.
So if we can combine the two, if we can get our kids in the clinical, I think it's really important for all parents to, one, get their kid registered in the University of Rochester registry, because then that's where we'll start. If you're in there, we can pull from those and start getting those parents to go back and get their records. If we get someone to sort of pull out that data that we need, and I think we will get there. I know June's working very hard on it. I know the FSHD study is working on it. Then, if we get them in the MOVE study, we can sort of combine the two, so that if, let's say, losmapimod is approved in a year or so, we'll have some natural history. Our whole goal is to pull our kids along with the traditional FSHD onset, so that when these drugs or these treatments are approved, that they can then be shortly approved for our kids. Because, and Ray, maybe you can speak to this, the off-label stuff, and if it's not approved for a child, it's going to be really hard for the doctors to prescribe that to them. Insurance won't pay for it.
Right.
A lot of doctors won't pay for it. And I can't think of anything worse than having a kid who's 7, 8, 9 years old, and there's a treatment out there, and I can't get it to my kid, right? So we need to pull this stuff along so that we're ready. And also, if we can convince a pharmaceutical to do a trial, we already have all the patient information right there. And we say, look, we have these kids and we're ready to go. So Ray, you want to speak to that just a little bit about how the parents can get involved, how we can help move this process along, and off-label, and how that whole process works?
So I can tell you what I do know, and that is that I think these concepts are all spot on. So one of the things, and I'll just tell you an experience I had to tell you that I've been deeply involved in this, and there are some challenges I want to share with you. So in 2013, the company I worked for was working for the MDA on some of their national registries. And the MDA is kind of a misnomer. They're not just the Muscular Dystrophy Association. They actually have 43 different diseases under their umbrella. They're all neuromuscular, but ALS is not a muscular dystrophy. Pompe disease is not a muscular dystrophy, and yet they all fall under that umbrella. So what they wanted to do was they have their registries, because they're a very interesting patient advocacy group. They're the only group that I'm aware of that have access to about 170 different hospitals in the United States for greater than 70 years or longer. As far as I know, if anybody on this phone can tell me what patient advocacy group has an access like that, I would love to know, because I'm not aware of any of them. So I thought they'd be the right person to do it. So my daughter and I wrote an article on the case for a national registry. And the national registry, what it would be is, so everybody who has the disease or whatever registers, but then the progression would be, the next thing would be is to get involved in a natural history study. The next thing after a natural history study is to get involved in primary and secondary endpoints. And then the ultimate goal of that registry would be to get to a clinical trial ready network. And that's really what we all want right here now. So they're moving towards that. And, I knew that what was then the MDA CEO at the time, and convinced her that FSHD was probably way more common than what people thought. So that's included in one of their first 7 drugs, because they can't do all 43. They didn't have enough money. And then also with the COVID pandemic, what's happened to a lot of patient advocacy groups. The FSHD Society is an exception to the rule, because the rule for most patient advocacy groups is that it's been very, very hard, because a lot of the funding activities have been curtailed, and there's been a lot of furloughs. In the MDA, they lost about half their people. So, it's been very difficult. But the Mover Data Hub is something that I have been involved in, and I've seen that with the natural history study. I've seen the importance of natural history, and I've also seen where companies that have a good drug are forced to go and do 1 or 2 years of natural history study before they can actually do the stuff, because they don't have anything to compare it against. To June's point earlier, they don't have anything to really compare. Like, how are you going to tell if it's changing there? And the other thing I've seen in FSHD is I've seen twin sisters where one has marked progression and one has very little or almost no progression, clinical progression, and they're identical. How do you account for that? Like, the average doctor doesn't have an easy answer for that any more than I do. And I've seen it in my own family where siblings progress at a different rate. One sibling progressed at a different rate than another. How can you explain that? It's difficult to know. You need a lot of data to do that. The one thing that the FDA wants too is they want repetitive, consistent, and something that could be repeatable type of data, right? So, like, were your kids measured with the 6-minute walk test? Because that's largely fallen out of favor. That was something that my I know both my children underwent. Is there some use in that data? Yes, absolutely. There is use in that data. But people have moved away in the Duchenne community to like a North Star ambulatory assessment, because it's a multifactorial assessment that takes into account multiple things. So you're not just relying on, I've seen kids that have come into the care clinic at Kennedy Krieger after they've just traveled from West Coast United States, and the kids are fatigued and tired. Is that kid have the same chance as a kid that's local in Baltimore and just, go across the town, in the family van and is well rested? Is that person going to have the same 6-minute walk test as the other person? I would argue no. Can you carry something or not when you're with FSH? Some people I've seen them use balancing things or asked to use balancing and not. Do you do it when the person steps off the line, when their foot just first stops off, or when both feet go over the line? There's a lot of questions around the 6-minute walk test. You can read it in the literature, but things are moving towards primary and secondary endpoints. So the data has to be good, and it has to be of a certain quality. And like I said, even when my daughter was involved, they didn't even have a clinical diagnosis. I mean, they didn't have a genetic diagnosis. They only had a clinical diagnosis available. So you are going to have disparate forms of data. I do think it is worth trying to do, but just realize that there are some limitations with trying to gather disparate data sources and trying to put them all together. Also think you're going to find a funding issue to have someone who's going to be willing to be reliable and do it. And then you also have to realize that, as Americans, we have to realize that the HIPAA laws still apply, and you have to be very careful about sharing data with anyone. It has to be done in a HIPAA compliant way. So one thing that scares a lot of people is when you're dealing with data sources is that if anybody could go on mute who's not talking, that'd be great.
I'm sorry.
And then I lost my train of thought, but anyway.
How about HIPAA compliance?
Oh, yeah, but so there's HIPAA and privacy regulations, and that's one thing why companies like our company, Syneos Health, that I work for, are in existence, because so I'll just tell you another hat that I wear. Like I said, I told a couple folks here as they were joining, is I'm a veterinarian. And when I worked with a couple of veterinary schools who wanted to do clinical trials, they didn't realize that all the data that they had to fall within the regulatory boundaries. And that's another thing, is you have to use, that all the data that you use and the way you manipulate it and share it has to all fall within the laws of the country, right? So HIPAA and electronic compliance and stuff. And that's why things like, I've worked with people to use like electronic health records. One thing that the FSHD side could do, if there was unlimited money, and we don't have unlimited money, unfortunately, at least as far as I know, but if we did have unlimited money, we could go to, say, even all the MDA care centers and look at all their electronic health record data and just pull it automatically. You wouldn't even have to have a parent do it. As long as you had approval from the parents to do it, you just pull it electronically and you can use that. And that's kind of the basis for what the mover is for the MDA. So it takes a lot of, because if you have individual people doing it, it's going to be actually harder. But again, it's a rare disease, so there's not as many people maybe that have it. So, I think it's worth exploring, but I'm just saying you are going to come under some challenges, and you do have to follow some rules and regulations when manipulating data. So just keep that in mind as you go forward. I mean, I wouldn't mind if you can identify a couple people from this group who are very dedicated, a couple, not like everybody, but a couple people who you can identify, Allie, and I will have you meet the people who run the natural histories and make natural history studies for Syneos Health. Because they run in the millions of dollars, and find out what the cheapest, fastest and most regulatory compliant way might be, just from a conversation, a brainstorming conversation, to put a little more professionalism and a little more realism around some of the topics and stuff like that. I'm not an expert on it, but I know enough about it, and I have helped, and I've even advised on certain natural history studies and stuff. But again, I only can add one portion of what's all, so there's a universe of what could be done, and that's unlimited money, right? And then there's the universe that we live in with very limited money, and maybe, a couple of dozen at the most patients. It wouldn't be hundreds, probably. I don't think we would have that many, although it would be great. I mean, to get thousands if you could, but So I don't even know, what that would be, but I would be willing to take that and explore it within our own company more. Because, for my own kids and for everybody on this call who's of interest in this topic, I think it's, it'd be worth exploring further. But I just realized, I just want you guys to know too. And in the book, if you do get the book, there's a whole chapter on natural histories. And the interesting thing was, and I'm unabashedly biased, is I had Sharon Hesterly. I asked Sharon Hesterly to write it. She's an EVP, Executive Vice President with the MDA, and she's worked in industry and outside industry. She's really a smart person, and she's involved with Mover for a plug for it. So the other thing I would say to the group is scarce data is scarce. So the more data you can get, the more convincing you'll have for the FDA, a regulatory body, or a payer. First, is there a way we could look at what the FSHD Society has? And then are there any other databases that could potentially have FSHD patients early onset that would be willing to share? So another contact would be, I'd be willing, Allie, to put you in contact with Sharon Hesterly to find out, would they be willing to discuss with you how to access early onset patients via MDA's registry, and is there a way that you could access that information and get it for patients' benefits?
I can answer that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have a question. So I'm a nurse, obviously. I'm in the healthcare industry and payer relations. Can't you do retrospective studies based on like CPT codes, and only the hospital can give consent? That way, they give no PHI, but they can pull based on codes and give you data information versus everybody going one by one getting their EMR. Like partnering with academic centers that are known for studying FSHD and doing one of those, blind studies where we pull based on coding. Is that something?
So coding could be an option that you could use, but you do need to realize it's only been, I think this is only the third year this October where we've had an ICD-10 code for FSHD specifically. For that, we don't have that. And to be honest with you, 3 years seems like a long time, but I actually had the same conversation with June earlier today that 3 years is not really a lot of information. We don't know how much that represents of the total population, but we realize too that FSHD is like the other muscular dystrophies. There's some folks that have milder forms of, say, FSHD that don't even report it. It doesn't even go into a clinical record. And quite frankly, people ask me, and I give them an answer that they might not anticipate, and that is, are you sure you want to self-disclose you have FSHD? If you have a mild form, you will be discriminated against in the United States. That's the state of the art. That's what world we live in. We don't live in Europe. We're not protected. So, if insurance company says you have a prior disclosable condition and you don't say it, that's not acceptable. And then, your spouse, let's say if you're married, you have FSH and you disclose you have it, they may or may not insure you. And that's just the reality that we live in the United States. Coupled with that is, even though we live in the United States, we don't really live in the United States. We live in all different 50 states, and each state has their own rules and regulations. And I can tell you, North Carolina is like at the bottom of being supportive of people with disabilities and stuff. And states like Massachusetts are closer to the top. So, that's one thing I found out in the last year. So, there's a very disparate healthcare system in the United States, just one of the myriad of problems that we have. But ICD-10 codes are limited. The other thing that kind of stinks is that there's no real digital footprint for FSHD patients, so we could find them using like natural learning progression or artificial intelligence, which is being used a lot now too, to find patients, even patients that aren't diagnosed. I mean, I've talked about people that say that they could, and I envision this, so I'm kind of like forward projecting here, which I'm not allowed to do as part of my job because of, stock prices stuff, but I'm taking my Syneos health out and now my parent hat on. And what I will tell you is that there are people looking at AI and natural learning and stuff and machine learning and things to find out if they could diagnose people with FSHD, because even my daughter was misdiagnosed 3 or 4 times, and then it took a little while to get to her diagnosis as well with FSHD, because that was only when there was a clinical test. It's much easier now that you have a battery of clinical tests, but still, I mean, you meet enough people with FSHD to say that they didn't get diagnosed on the first time they went to a clinic, unless it runs in your family where you kind of know aunt or uncle or dad or mom has it, then, you may not know, and it may take a little while to get through that diagnostic odyssey. They say in the rare disease world, sometimes it can take on average 7 years. I've seen that figure thrown out there. I've met people with limb girdle that I've seen 10 or 20 years. I've talked to people that said for 10 or 20 years, they didn't know what they had.
So just to give you some, I did look at some data that we pulled. We're doing this big health economic study, and we're analyzing some large payer data sets This is anonymized data. It's from claims, health insurance claims data. So we pulled about 1,200 based on the ICD-10 code, which is the first international standard code for FSHD patients. This has only been used since 2018. Using that code out of a database of like over 100 million patients, individual patients, we found 1,200 with FSHD, of which 20 individuals were under the age of 18. Okay. So what does that tell you? What it tells me, first of all, kids are the rare, but it's even less than what you would expect from what we know. I think it's that it just takes them longer to be diagnosed. It's unusual. Kids can be manifesting symptoms, so they're just not getting diagnosed at that age.
I'm actually going through that right now, what you're talking about. So I just thought I would jump in really fast. I'm so sorry. But I am going through exactly what you're talking about. We thought we were going to get a diagnosis, and we didn't. They decided they were not going to diagnose her, even though she, did the gene. We, figured out, she couldn't raise her hands all the way above her head. She's 2. They don't want to go through any more testing because, she's 2 and she screams and all that kind of stuff. But like, it's frustrating because it's like, it's right there and, it's a blessing and it's not, like Ray was saying, it's like you want to know or you want to find it, but it's hard because I'm frustrated because I feel like they're not going to diagnose her because she's not showing symptoms that they want to see her. And it's just frustrating because I feel like I don't know where I belong. Does that make sense? Like, I don't know if I can do studies if she's not formally diagnosed or, what do I need to look for? She's 2, she's already delayed, and stuff like that. So I'm kind of going through what you're talking about is not being able to find a place. Like, I don't know where I belong because she has the gene, but like they don't want to diagnose her yet. So I'm just frustrated.
Trying to understand what that means. So she has had a genetic test showing she has FSHD, but the doctors just don't want to take the final step and say, this is her diagnosis. Is that what?
And we saw a neurologist with Riley's Children's Hospital in Indianapolis. And, we were assuming that we were going to get the information for the actual diagnosis. Right. We had no idea going in there to not be diagnosed, because we were so excited that we finally figured out, what was wrong. And, it's been crazy, but like, I feel, saddened because I don't know, like now, like, is the MOVE study, is that something that I can do because my daughter's not formally diagnosed, but yet she has the gene for that? Like, I guess I'm one of those parents that are, I don't know what to do. I don't even know where I belong. But I'm here, I guess. And, with what Ray and everybody's been saying, I feel like there does need to be a little bit more information for us parents that we can kind of go to each other. Okay, well, what did you experience when your daughter was 2? Or, like Ray, daughter, you guys didn't have the DNA testing, so I'm on the complete opposite side, which, we could,
we look back and we can even see symptoms in our daughter where she couldn't close her eyes and had things when she was really little, but we didn't put 2 and 2 together. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I'm a clinician. I mean, for at least veterinary medicine, I can spot diseases in dogs that, most people can't, and I can spot things because I know about that. And yet, I can tell you 2 things that you see. One is they say physicians don't diagnose their own kids too easy. Well, veterinarians can't diagnose their own kids either. It's not easy because you see it every day, and then you get blinded to some of the things because you're not seeing things objectively because you just know things. But when you look back, like I can notice things from my daughter when she was little, like I said, not closing her eyes or breathing things and stuff like that. She actually had to go to a speech pathologist when she was younger. And I didn't realize that was due to weak muscles. I never put 2 and 2 together and said, oh, she got a speech pathologist diagnosis that there's something wrong with her speech and she couldn't articulate as well as someone else. And that's related to a muscular dystrophy. Like I never got it. It just went by me. Yeah. But I will tell you, Jesse, if you're not happy with that the beautiful thing about America too, still, is that we do have second and third opinions. And I'll tell you, when I had to go for surgery for my son, the first person I went to was Catherine Wagner because she's not only a physician, but she sits on the board of the FSHD Society, and she's a trusted ally of people with FSHD patients. So I wouldn't say everybody should probably flood poor Catherine Wagner's email or her, LinkedIn profile, but she is a champion of FSHD Society, and she can tell you a second or third place to go. And I'd even trust June and the other folks at FSHD Society that there's other folks you can go to get the formal diagnosis. Because I do think it's important. I think it's important for not only getting in clinical trials to see what your options are, your treatment options are, because I do think now, as I get older, that clinical trials is still one treatment option. It's not the only treatment option, but it's a treatment option. You need to keep it on the table. So, one of the options might be to try it, and if your kid qualifies based on the criteria that's set up for that clinical trial, then that's an option and you should seriously consider it. So you do need a diagnosis. And I also think it's important, so important psychologically, at least to know what you're fighting, because to fight the unknown is much harder than at least fighting the known, in my opinion. I mean, I don't like the truth sometimes. And to be honest with you, I'll look back in my life and I can tell you where I've failed and I've been in denial. Like when I didn't think my son had FSHD a while before my wife did, because I didn't want to believe it. I was thinking, well, I have 2 kids and it's a 50% chance. So, hopefully he doesn't have it. And he did have it. So for a while, I probably was sitting on the fence looking back now. But at the time, I thought I was doing the right thing. But looking back, I think I made a mistake. But, those are all factors that need to, and a second opinion would be something you could always do too. I know.
So Jesse? Yeah.
Go ahead.
So what I recommend is that you talk to Michaela Walker, who is the study coordinator, the central study coordinator for the MOVE study. And I think the closest location for you might be Kansas City. I'm not 100% sure. Maybe Ohio. I have to look at a map. Ohio State, maybe. I don't know. But somewhere there.
Yeah.
Is Kansas City, like, how many hours drive is that for you?
A while.
Wow. Okay. There might be better look. Yeah. Anyway, I'll have to look at a map. But
yeah. Indianapolis. Indianapolis is where we are, but I'm in Fort Wayne, which is up towards Michigan. So.
Okay. Yeah. There's unfortunately usually there are only 12 centers across the U.S. So there's not always one right nearby, but it might be, it might be worth a trip. I mean, if they can see her and actually give her a diagnosis and you're interested in also enrolling in the MOVE study, I mean, I think they will go to great lengths.
It's a 9-hour drive. So, yeah, I just figured it out I'm in Kansas
Google
City.
Maps.
I'm in Kansas City, so an easy map quest for me.
Okay. Yeah, she's
I
only
can tell
2.
you, it's a no fun, but I just drove from Boston to Morrisville, North Carolina this past weekend, so it's doable. You can do it, but it does take a toll on you. So, use your significant other.
Let's see. Oh, maybe Columbus, Ohio might be closer.
Yeah.
Oh, that sounds much closer.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's another clinical trial research network site. So that might be something to consider. And just email me. I can put you in touch with Marco Tillis, I think, is their study coordinator. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, good luck.
I would definitely want to get the diagnosis if I were you. So we're approaching about an hour. We had a lot of information in this hour. Is there anyone who has any pressing questions, either for June or for Ray or for the group before we wrap it up? So I think the takeaways from today are: please get your child registered with the University of Rochester, and that is a paper registry. You're gonna have to go down there, you're gonna have to print some things and mail it in. I think they are working on getting it digitized maybe in the future, June, but right now it is paper.
It's ready, except they have to get through the IRB, and
That's
there's-
part of the regulations I was telling you guys about that they have to follow. So that's an institutional review board, and that's a board of experts and people that have to look at things like this and say that it's compliant with certain regulations and certain rules.
But I think it's really important to get them in there. Look at the clinicaltrials.gov. Just put in the keyword FSHD. The trials will come up. The MOVE study is in there. You can see the locations. There's a point of contact there. It's very easy. Just email them. They'll give you all the information on how you can get your kids signed up if you want to do that. I will be back in touch with Ray. We'll get a couple people to talk to your people more about natural history and our way forward.
Pick out your folks. I know all the folks in our real world late phase group, which, natural history study is considered real world data. That's like the fancy term name. So when you see real world data, that's can be a natural history because that is a source of it. There are also groups that you don't need to do this de novo. This isn't something that has not been done before. This has been done by other groups. In fact, it's been done by muscular dystrophy groups. So the Duchenne group community, you could look at them, some things that they do. We can hook you up with those folks so that they can show you some things that they've done. And I also even helped understand better about there's a study called the GRASP study, GRASP, and it stands for an acronym. Each name stands for something, just like MOVE and RESOLVE and all these others. They all have names for the limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. And that one's one of the best ones I've ever seen because that takes into taking it from a registry to a natural history study to identify primary and secondary endpoints for clinical study that's acceptable to the regulators to a clinical trial ready network. So it incorporates the whole spectrum of the things I was telling you guys about that is important for a drug to get developed and get to the market. And folks like Fulcrum understand that, all too well because, that's what they're dealing with in order to get their drug approved. But to Ali's point, I just want to say that it's not just about approval, it's about access. We want to make sure we have access to everybody. Each person, whether you're in a wheelchair, you're not in a wheelchair, or whether you're older or whether you're little, everybody needs to be involved. So.
Right, and I just want to reiterate, right now, the only clinical trial is the MOVE study that incorporates anyone under 18 right now with FSHD, whether that's 1 or 2. So we want to change that, and we want to bring our kids along, and we want to get them involved in studies, and we want them able to get the treatment when the treatment comes down. Yeah. So we need to do some work to get there. So it's really important that we all work as a group. We get this stuff figured out. It's very complicated, but we can do it. If you guys have questions, if you want to volunteer to do some, please contact me at the Early-onset Chapter at fshtsdsociety.org. We can organize this stuff. We'll be in contact. I know Kristen's been contacting parents as well. So we can get organized so we can move forward. I don't want to spin my wheels. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about it and not a lot of action. We need, time is of the essence. Any of us that have, early onset kiddos know that we don't want to see them progress. And we want to keep them out of a wheelchair if we can. So we have some work to do. Also, I know, and Lee, are you still? Lee's not on. We are going to get a central telephone number. So newly diagnosed parents or parents that have questions or they're just going through a hard time, because my kid's 16. I've gone through a lot of stages with him. I know there's some parents that have older kids that I reach out to. Parents with younger kids can reach out to me, even if you weren't just newly diagnosed, but you just had a question about, the doctors are telling me this. Like, for example, they tried to put my kid on a feeding tube twice, and twice we have managed for him to gain weight without doing that, right? So call me. If your kids, the doctors are telling you something, I do it all the time for older kids too. They're telling him this, he's getting ready to go to college, he's going to drive. How do you navigate this? So there's going to be a central telephone line, and Lee can talk about this, and we want volunteers from this community to man that phone. So ideally, someone would call, an email message would go out to the volunteers. You'd get a message and say someone will contact you back within 24 hours or whatever. A parent will respond to them and say, I'm here to listen. What are you going through? How can I help? And maybe if you can't help, someone who can, right? Yeah. If someone asks me if their kid's 10 and this is what my kid's going through, I can maybe answer that question. But if I can't, I can maybe connect you with someone who can. So when is that line going to be up and running, Lee?
So actually, Ellie, as soon as you and I can connect and we can get the voicemail greeting set, we can get it started. So we finished that setup end of last week. So we just need to get the greeting that people will receive. So it'll all be voicemail because it's manned all by volunteers, as you mentioned, Allie. And then anyone can call in and just share, connect, ask questions. And then Allie will help us, make sure that gets to someone who can make that connection. There is nothing, I think, more lonely than feeling like you're walking a journey like this alone. And we want to help, mitigate that and help families make that connection.
Right. And the other thing we're working on is a resource page, just resources for a lot of things, how to navigate the school system with IEPs, vans, durable medical equipment, all that kind of thing. We're going to put on this resource page so that you can go there and at least it'll link you to something so you know where those resources are so they can help you out. We're currently working on that as well. And if anybody has any other ideas or anything to make your lives easier or how we can help one another, please reach out to me and we can certainly talk about that. Christian, do you have anything to add before we go?
I do. I just want to say, Ray, thank you so much for joining. I'm waiting for your book to arrive, so I'm sure I'll be reaching out with lots of questions because I'm not in the medical field, and it goes well above me. To thank you all for coming. It's great to see how many boxes are on the Zoom call. I know, Allie, I hope this makes your heart a little happier. And also want to thank Allie for everything she's doing. This is volunteer on her part. This is her free time, and she is dedicating this to our kids. Her kid is probably, by the time there is a therapy, her child will be an adult. So she is actually doing this for the little ones, not just her child. And that is amazing to me. So thank you, Allie, for everything you're doing on this. It's the time you're putting into this is absolutely, it takes my breath away. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you all for being here. And I hope that, this group next week or next month, we're going to talk about physical therapy, which I know is all near and dear to all of our hearts and how we can get our kids moving. I want to thank Ray, June, as always, and Lee. You guys are on Zoom meetings, it seems like all the time. So thank you for joining one more. And all you parents, please reach out. Let's be a cohesive group. We're all going through this together and we can all help each other. And we can, I know we can move this forward and we can get our kids, treatment sooner rather than later, which is all of our goals.